The history we know was written by the victors, but the course of World War II was far from inevitable. There were moments when the balance was fragile, decisions that could have gone differently, mistakes that might never have been made. When we ask what would have happened if Germany had won, we are not engaging in simplistic fiction. We are examining a scenario that, at certain points between 1940 and 1942, was strategically possible. Imagine Europe in 1945, not as a liberated continent, but as one consolidated under German control. France would not have been restored as a sovereign republic. Poland would not have been rebuilt. The Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and large parts of Eastern Europe would have remained under direct or indirect administration from Berlin. The United Kingdom, isolated after the fall of the continent, might have been forced into an armistice, formally independent, yet operating under severe strategic limitations. Without Britain as a base, the United States would have faced enormous difficulty projecting military power onto the European mainland. The Soviet Union represented the largest territorial obstacle. If Moscow had fallen decisively and Soviet leadership had fractured or been pushed beyond the Urals without the ability to reorganize, Eastern Europe would have become a zone of radical restructuring. German expansion was not limited to military occupation. There was a long-term demographic project that envisioned massive population displacement and systematic colonization by ethnic Germans. Entire cities would have been redesigned, administrative structures replaced. Over decades, the cultural identity of entire regions could have been fundamentally altered. A German victory would not have meant territorial control alone. It would have meant the global legitimization of an authoritarian model built on racial hierarchy and absolute centralization of power. The historical defeat of the Nazi regime created a minimum international consensus against certain practices. Without that defeat, that consensus may never have emerged. The modern concept of universal human rights could have been delayed by generations. International war crimes trials would likely never have taken place. The world would not have witnessed a tribunal equivalent to Nuremberg, establishing global legal precedents. For those who understand the true nature of war, it is important to separate emotion from structure. At its peak, Germany possessed an extremely efficient military machine, a fully mobilized industrial base, and leadership willing to take significant strategic risks. Its early advances were swift and devastating. Had certain tactical and logistical decisions been different, the final outcome might have changed. Now consider the impact on the United States. Without playing the role of Europe's liberator, America's moral standing in the post-war world would have been entirely different. Washington might have focused on consolidating influence in the Western Hemisphere, maintaining a defensive posture against a hostile European bloc. The 20th century might not have been defined by a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, but by a tense balance between a democratic Western Hemisphere and a Eurasia dominated by a German authoritarian empire. Technology would have followed a different path. German scientists were leading advanced research in rocketry and aeronautical engineering. Without defeat and the subsequent transfer of specialists to the United States, space development might have unfolded under a German flag. The nuclear race would also have taken a different trajectory. Although the German nuclear program was not as advanced as the American Manhattan Project in 1945, a war concluded under favorable conditions would have allowed resources to be redirected and research to continue uninterrupted. The world's first nuclear power might have been Germany, yet perhaps the most profound shift would not have been military or technological. It would have been psychological. Victory validates narratives. If the Nazi regime had triumphed, its ideology would have been presented as a model of efficiency and stability. Generations would grow up under the assumption that the system was not only powerful, but correct. Propaganda would cease to be an emergency mobilization tool and become a permanent cultural framework. And yet there is a strategic reality that must be confronted honestly. Empires built on constant expansion often face internal limits. Maintaining vast territories requires resources, economic integration, and political stability. The Third Reich was heavily centralized around Adolf Hitler. Even in victory, his eventual death would have opened inevitable internal power struggles. Highly personalist regimes rarely manage smooth transitions. The absence of a clear institutional succession process could have led to silent internal conflicts or even fragmentation. Economically, rebuilding a devastated Europe under authoritarian rule would have required massive investment. The cost of prolonged occupation and systematic repression could have produced long-term financial strain. Early stability might have masked accumulating tension. Still, in the first decades after a hypothetical victory, the international perception would likely have been one of unquestioned dominance. Smaller nations would align their foreign policies out of strategic necessity. The world would live under the shadow of concentrated power in Berlin, with heavily militarized borders and intensified surveillance. When we analyze this scenario coldly, we realize the question is not simply who controls the map, but what kind of international order emerges. A system based on multilateral agreements and cooperation would have been unlikely. In its place would stand a hierarchical structure sustained by military force and political coercion. And this is where the reflection becomes uncomfortable. Germany's defeat in 1945 was not merely a military event. It was a moral and structural turning point for the modern world. Without that defeat, the 20th century might have been defined by the prolonged consolidation of authoritarian regimes. The question is not whether such an empire would last forever. None do. The question is how long it would shape the world before confronting its own internal limits. If Germany had won World War II, the most dangerous phase would not have been conquest, but consolidation. Winning a war is a military operation. Sustaining victory is a decades-long project. And the Third Reich's project was never limited to defeating enemy armies. It aimed to reorganize the very structure of Europe and gradually the global order. In the years immediately following victory, there would have been a deliberate attempt at normalization. Borders would be officially redrawn. Local governments would function under German supervision. The European economy would be integrated into a centralized system, with Berlin as its industrial and political axis. War-damaged infrastructure would be rebuilt, but according to strategic logic designed to serve the empire. Railways, ports, and industrial hubs would be redesigned to strengthen continental self-sufficiency. This reconstruction would not have been neutral. It would have been accompanied by social engineering. Educational systems across the German sphere of influence would be restructured. Curricula would emphasize discipline, hierarchy, and the narrative that the 1945 victory corrected the injustices imposed on Germany after World War I. A new generation would grow up without memory of Nazi defeat, taught that the political model had prevailed because it was superior. In Eastern Europe, transformation would likely have been harsher. German colonization plans envisioned population displacement on a massive scale. Millions could have been removed from their land to make room for German settlements. This would not happen overnight, but gradually and administratively. Records altered, property transferred, communities dissolved. Over 20 or 30 years, the demographic composition of the region could have been dramatically reshaped. Such restructuring produces surface stability, but underground tension. Resistance movements would likely persist, fragmented and infiltrated by increasingly sophisticated intelligence services. Technology, once mobilized for war, would be redirected toward continental-scale internal surveillance. Meanwhile, the United States would face an unprecedented strategic reality. Without the need to liberate Europe, America might adopt a more isolationist stance, or, conversely, invest in preventive militarization against the European bloc. U.S. foreign policy would revolve around indirect containment, building alliances across the Americas and perhaps the Pacific. The 20th century might be defined by constant tension between two irreconcilable systems, but not the specific Cold War dynamic we know. And one variable changes the balance entirely: nuclear weapons. Even if the German program lagged behind the Manhattan Project in 1945, a war concluded on favorable terms would free up resources and intellectual capital. If Germany developed atomic weapons before, or alongside, the United States, the world would enter a nuclear age under authoritarian leadership. Nuclear deterrence would cease to be a balance between rival superpowers and become an instrument of imperial consolidation. This raises a structural question. What happens to international law when the victorious regime rejects the very idea of universal legal standards? Without war trials, without reinforced conventions, without strong multilateral institutions, the concept of international accountability for atrocities might have been suffocated before it fully formed. If you've made it this far, take a moment to reflect on how much the world we live in depended on a specific outcome in 1945. If this analysis is helping you see the war beyond the battles and understand its structural consequences, leave a comment sharing what stands out most to you in this alternate scenario. And if you value serious, responsible discussions about military history and geopolitics, subscribe to the channel. Content like this continues because of viewers who understand the importance of historical memory. The consolidation of a continental empire, however, would not eliminate internal vulnerabilities. The Third Reich was highly centralized around charismatic and authoritarian leadership. Even with military victory, political succession would remain a sensitive issue. Hitler's death, inevitable at some point, would trigger competition among different factions of the regime. Without a strong institutional framework for transition, internal stability could be tested. Moreover, maintaining vast territories under occupation demands constant resources. Security, repression, economic integration, and bureaucratic administration consume human and financial capital. Historically, empires experience strain when attempting to control diverse populations through permanent force. Early stability can conceal long-term fractures. Culturally, the world would follow a different trajectory as well. The artistic and scientific exchange between America and Europe that shaped the second half of the 20th century might have been drastically reduced. Technological innovation could continue, but guided by specific ideological and strategic priorities. Academic and artistic freedom would likely be confined to narratives approved by the regime. Most significant, however, is the collective psychological impact. The defeat of Nazism created a symbolic global rejection of racial totalitarianism. In a victory scenario, that symbolic rupture never occurs. Entire generations might grow up believing that racial hierarchy and centralized authoritarianism were effective, historically validated models. This does not mean such an empire would last indefinitely. No political structure is immune to economic strain, social change, or internal crisis. But even a few decades of dominance would have been enough to profoundly alter the course of the 20th century. Civil rights movements, decolonization, European integration, and even global political culture might have followed radically different paths. The question then shifts from, what would the world look like, to, how long would that world endure before confronting its own limits? Because every victory carries within it the seed of its next crisis. Imagine being born in 1965 in a Europe where the dominant flag is not merely a national symbol, but the permanent emblem of a continental empire. You would have no memory of war. For you, that order would simply be normal. That is how victories become permanent, when they stop being remembered as conquest and begin to be accepted as structure. If Germany had won in 1945, the decades that followed would not have been marked by democratic reconstruction, but by ideological consolidation. The generation that grew up after victory would not see an exceptional regime. They would see an established system. Schools would teach an official version of history. Science and culture would be directed by political criteria. Citizenship would be defined by usefulness to the state. Over time, the empire would face an unavoidable reality. Governing is not the same as conquering. Administering a continent requires efficiency, economic predictability, and social stability. The military machine that won battles would have to transform into an administrative machine, and that transformation would demand difficult choices. Either the regime would ease certain controls to preserve productivity and innovation, or it would intensify surveillance to prevent ideological fractures. Both paths carry risk. If controls were loosened, pressures for genuine political participation would emerge. If repression continued indefinitely, economic creativity could suffocate. Modern states depend on constant technological innovation. Highly centralized systems often struggle to absorb internal criticism, and criticism is the engine of scientific progress. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States would not disappear. It would remain an industrial and technological power. Rivalry between the two blocs would shape the planet. It might not resemble the Cold War as we know it, but nuclear competition, espionage, and proxy disputes across other regions would be almost inevitable. In that scenario, Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia could become strategic battlegrounds. Independence movements might receive selective backing or face suppression, depending on bloc interests. The 20th century would be less about international cooperation and more about rigid spheres of control. But there is an even deeper layer. Without the formal defeat of the Nazi regime, there would be no international trial establishing clear standards for crimes against humanity. International law evolved from that historical rupture. Without it, global legal precedent forms differently, or not at all. That changes everything. Human rights might remain internal matters rather than universal standards. The idea that leaders can be held globally accountable might never gain traction. Diplomacy would be far more pragmatic and far less principle-driven. As decades pass, even a victorious empire would experience strain. Rigid structures accumulate invisible pressure. Internal corruption, succession disputes, cultural differences among occupied territories, none of this disappears with military victory. It is merely contained. And history shows that permanent containment carries a cost. The empire might survive for decades. It might slowly fragment. It might evolve into something less ideological and more pragmatic. The precise inflection point is impossible to predict. But no victory permanently eliminates the human forces that question concentrated power. The most striking aspect of this scenario is not only what would exist, but what would not. There would be no comparable push for European integration, no collective effort to prevent continental war through economic cooperation. In our world, the memory of devastation became an argument for unity. In that world, it would be replaced by a narrative of imperial triumph. Global culture would also look different. Film, literature, music, and philosophy reflect political context. The 20th century we know produced artistic movements deeply shaped by the experience of war and resistance to totalitarianism. Under a different order, those expressions would be molded by different constraints and incentives. And there is something even more subtle. The post-1945 world was built on the idea that certain lines must never be crossed again. That awareness emerged from documented horror and the defeat of the regime responsible. Without that defeat, the historical message shifts. What today stands as a warning example might have been presented as proof of successful power. That alters collective psychology. When societies believe absolute power can prevail indefinitely, they organize themselves differently. Alliances form out of constant fear. Trust between nations diminishes. International balance becomes more unstable. The world might have been technologically advanced. Cities might have been rebuilt under monumental architecture. There might have been years of apparent stability, but stability is not the same as freedom or plurality, and that is the core of this hypothesis. It is not merely about who controls territory, it is about which values become dominant. Germany's defeat in 1945 was not just a military event. It was a rupture that redefined global moral boundaries. Had the outcome been different, the 20th century would have grown under a very different shadow. When we explore this possibility, we are not romanticizing war or simplifying history. We are recognizing how fragile the balance was that shaped the present. If you've made it this far, share your view. In this alternate world, what would have changed the most? Politically, technologically, or morally? And if you appreciate deep analysis of history's turning points, subscribe to the channel and continue the journey.